Okay, so now I'll read chapter 40. I got really excited. This is one of my favorite parts of the book. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully. But now he sat gazing at Big Thumb in the meadow full of flowers. He couldn't help but to wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, could there be more? He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling the entire plant, including the root. Onions. Hot, fresh, sweet onions, Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down to Main Street. So now we're doing a flashback, okay? I know some of you were getting a little confused on that. This is kind of flashing back in time. And notice Mary Lou. Who is Mary Lou? Because they were talking about how she was a pretty lady. She's really a donkey. Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down the main street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sun was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along the shore. Mrs. Gladys Tennyson was wearing her nightgown and a robe as she came running out the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who would never go out into public without dressing in fine clothing and a hat, so it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule in the cart. "Good morning, Mrs. Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smile. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you." "I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserves most of the credit." "The good Lord does, yes," said Mrs. Tennyson, "but not Mr. Hawthorne. That whack wanted me to put leeches in her stomach. Leeches, my word. He said that they would suck out the bad blood. Now, you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood?" "I don't know," said Sam. "It's your onion tonic," said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way out to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" "Does your husband know that you're parading in bed clothing?" said Hattie asked. There were more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed." "Thank you," said Mrs. Tennyson. "We both have been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died of a stomach illness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me real sick as well," said Mrs. Tennyson. "But it nearly killed Becca with her being so young. Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Hanny said contritely. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash those knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself and turned quickly and walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it, to come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Mrs. Tennyson bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou. I'm sure she'd appreciate it." "All right, then," said Mrs. Tennyson. "Give my change in onions." Sam gave Mrs. Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero so we're back to Stanley and Zero now. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days, ate onions, all they wanted, splashed dirty water into their mouths, and in the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up the mud to make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and onions seemed to be doing him good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Stanley was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think that he had deserted him. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "Think I'll go look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he had made 2 days earlier. There were a few pieces he wasn't sure if he had gone right, but then it took a little bit of searching before he'd find the trail again. He went down quite a ways the mountain, but he didn't seem to find the shovel. He looked back towards the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downward just in case. He came to a bare spot, 2 large patches of weeds that sat down to rest. He had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired from walking downhill. It would be impossible for him to carry Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must have been buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions. Saw a large indentation in the weeds just a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely to be the shovel could be there, but he had already come this far. There, lying in some small weeds, he found the shovel and a jar of sacks. He was amazed. Wonder if the shovel and sacks might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken except for the one that had broken earlier. And if he had rolled down the hill, it's doubtful that he would have found the sack and the shovel by its side. On the way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. So I want to stop here for just a second because Stanley and Zero are getting better because they're eating onions. And in our flashback, you remember the onions is what saved Ruth, Gladys Tennyson's daughter. So there's a connection here between the 2 onions. The onions are the same. The onions that Sam was selling all those years ago, because remember, Sam is in the same Camp Green Lake, are the same onions that the boys have found. And it's what's saving them. We'll have to keep reading next week, but it's getting so good.